So, what is one of the most important questions when investing on the stock market? And it doesn't really matter whether you have billions to invest as an institutional investor or just $1,000 as someone who wants to save for the future of their kids. There is one sector everyone who saves and invests must understand because it influences every single investment decision. And the big question around the sector is, what is going on in politics in the world? Political decisions impact the global macroeconomic framework directly. Examples, just think about ESG. Governments from the United States, Europe, and China have prioritized it on their list. The result, it drives companies in that sector to higher valuations for a simple reason, because private companies and governments are allocating massive amounts of money in that area. Another example are the mRNA vaccines. Governments all over the world decided that mRNA vaccines are the right solution for that problem. And they were absolutely right. So the result of that decision is that, and this is really amazing because in only 1 year, vaccines on a commercial scale were available to everybody who wanted getting vaccinated. 1 year, and normally it takes a minimum of 10 to 15 years to bring a new medication to the market. Other areas are interest rates and inflation. Investment is not only equity or real estate, it in principle is also putting money into a savings account. When central banks and governments all over the world reduce interest rates down to zero and drive inflation higher, it impacts everybody because you don't make money with a savings account and the inflation starts killing it. It's quite simple. The fourth example we see currently in Ukraine, warfare has a considerable impact. On February 24, 2022, Russia started what they called a special operation in Ukraine, which Western governments call a war. What seems far away might be closer than everybody thinks. Ukraine and Russia are two of the world's major providers of natural resources like oil, gas, wheat, and similar. A war disrupts the supply chains and impacts the economy, not only locally, but in every single country of the world. In this episode of the All In podcast, the Besties talk about the effects of the war in Ukraine on the food and energy supply chains and present some ideas of how governments can deal with the situation. I showed 2 clips from episodes 74 and 75. Check out the links below in the description and enjoy the key takeaways from these 2 episodes.
Friedberg, a couple of weeks ago, you outlined the potential of famines caused by Putin's insane, war in Ukraine.
That's not what I said, but sure. I highlighted the risk.
I'm framing it the way I want, but you commented on the possible famine caused by Putin's insane war.
Again, not what I said, but sure. Yeah.
Well, let's go to famine before Sacks loses his mind about Biden's quote of regime change, which I'll let you end on, Sacks. You get your victory lap. But somebody came for you and said, hey, listen, Friedberg basically doesn't know what he's talking about, because commodity markets are showing that India and other folks are going to step up and there's not going to be a problem with famine. So can you unpack that for us?
I will tell you that we are already seeing a lot of scrambling happening for redundancy in these commodity supply chains. And there's a couple of issues, which I highlighted before, I'll highlight again. Number one is just the ability to export. So while there may be commodity products sitting in these markets, getting them on ships out of Russia, out of Ukraine, even if sanctions and trade restrictions are lifted and make them available, is very difficult because a lot of the carriers are concerned about insurance and liability, as they would be forced to go into a port and do a transaction with an entity that they're supposed to not do transactions with. So there's a lot of reasons why these ships are not going to port, not picking up product, and not bringing it to where it needs to go. Critical risk in Africa in the near term. So this is an acute problem with respect to transport. The next problem is with respect to planting. As of this week, and I'm going to put a couple of links in here, and these links Nick, are not in order with respect to what I'll say. But I'll kind of put a bunch of these things out here. But there is an expectation that we could see up to an 80% decline in planted acres in the Ukraine. And there's a bunch of really good anecdotes in this particular story about how farmers are scared about going out and planting because drones might blow them up. And I mean, look, you're in the middle of a war zone. You're not in a rush to go out and plant. And so there's a lot of planting that needs to happen in order for us to have, the expectation of the supply coming out of the field in about 6 months. So that's kind of the second stage of the problem, is a large export market for goods coming out of Ukraine and Russia we might have a kind of significant reduction in inventory as the number of acres that are planted goes down. And then the third thing that I highlighted before, which is absolutely still very true, and I have put some data in here that you can all look at, is related to the price of fertilizer. So fertilizer prices through the roof because nat gas has gone up, so ammonia prices have gone up. Potash exports are prohibited from Russia, so potash has gone up. And so as a result, we're seeing fertilizer prices shoot up. And in a lot of countries, what I've included here in this particular link in the chat, and Nick, on the YouTube, you can kind of put this on the screen, but there's a guy named Gary Schnitke. Gary is the ag economist. He's like the number one ag economist in the world. He's at University of Illinois. Everyone reads all his stuff in the industry. This guy breaks everything down to unit economics, numbers, helps people make decisions about what to plant, when, what the economics are. And he highlights the current economics for planting in Illinois. Illinois is the largest corn producing state in the U.S. and a critical supplier of our national kind of food supply. And he points out that as of right now, you would have to invest in Illinois about $810 to have a $243 return on corn because the price of fertilizer has gone so high. So you invest $810, you expect to make a little over $1,000, and these are not assuming rent. The problem is when you factor in the cost of rent, the average rent in Illinois is $227. So a lot of farmers in Illinois rent their land, about half do. And so for a lot of farmers, it's actually uneconomical, not just in Illinois, but around the world now, where the cost of the inputs, the cost of rent, the cost of production exceeds the expected profit coming out of the farm. And so farmers are not going to plant. And so, we're seeing kind of a major issue with these farmers around the world kind of making planting decisions right now that are informed by upside down economics. This is being monitored. Fortunately in the US, the USDA reported today that it looks like the price of corn is such that a lot of farmers are going to go back and plant soybeans. And we're seeing basically a historic planting survey coming out today that says farmers are in fact going to go out in the field. They are in fact going to plant. But this is not true everywhere. We haven't done the calculus on it yet, but there is a ton of anecdotal support and a ton of survey data that's coming out showing that farmers aren't going to plant the acres that they normally would plant because costs are so high. That means there's going to be less production over the next year. That means famine hits us in a year. That's a big problem.
Sacks wants to know why they don't just use DoorDash or Uber Eats. He's to just order more food if they can't get
This is not what's going through David's mind right now.
David is
honing in. He's like LeBron in the fourth quarter.
Yes.
There's a minute left. He's like, everybody get out of the way. Give me the ball.
Just ISO ball. He's going to do his ISO
ball. He's about to play ISO ball.
Clear out.
3,
All right, here we
2,
go.
1, David, go.
All right, here we go.
Friedberg, tell us, the second order, third order effects of fertilizer and food at this point. We've had this back and forth. And now I think the world is starting to realize, hey, Friedberg was right. These downstream effects are going to be significant. I asked you a question about these, which is, can the world not mobilize, if these are about 1% of the calories, 20 or 30% of the calories in a certain country, could the world not mobilize to find other caloric sources, rice, fish, soybeans, whatever? Or is our system so fragile that we can't rally around sending food to anywhere on the planet, despite the fact that we can fly anywhere and go on vacation for 2 weeks anywhere on the planet?
No, the food system is complex and efficient, but it does not have strong redundancy or malleability. So take, for example, how do you get flour? You get flour in your food from a food company that bought the flour from a miller. There are mills around the world that process wheat into flour. You can't take that same mill and process corn into flour. There's different technology, different equipment that's used. Same with soybeans and so on. So when you look at how the food supply chain is constructed, there's a local point of consumption, which is a store. Then there's a food processor, and you work your way kind of up the supply chain. And there's a certain input that's required to make the output that people consume. And so calories, while they might be fungible, practically speaking, or fundamentally speaking, they're not necessarily fungible, practically speaking, on the ground. When you actually try and plug in, let's say, soybeans into the milling supply chain to make the pasta or the bread that everyone consumes in Tunisia, it's not going to work. And the same is true with rice. And then the more important dynamic force that's underway is that these markets for food and commodities globally are not controlled by government. They're controlled by private businesses. And there's a market for these products. And so what happens is, as the food supply chain threat hit, countries like China and others started to stockpile. They started to buy lots and lots of supply, drive up their stocks and their reserves, for fear of the famine that's about to hit us in about 9 months. And when they did that, there was now less food available to Tunisia and to Eritrea and to Egypt and so on. And so we're starting to see the effects of that dislocation driving dynamic market forces where certain buyers stock up, and then the folks that can't afford to step in not being able to acquire product and being left. So not only do we have a local production differential that makes it hard to have all calories be fungible, we're also seeing this dynamic where there's a bifurcation where the haves have more and the have-nots have less. And that's going to really make this famine kind of hit home in a really, really sad way in the months to come. We're already seeing, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, as I mentioned a few weeks ago, the fertilizer problem driving acreage down. So the USDA farm report comes out. They survey farmers and figure out how much they're going to plant every year. And they just downgraded the number of corn acres that are going to get planted this year, which is happening starting this month, from 93 million acres to 89 million. That doesn't sound like a lot, but 4 million acres. Yeah. 4 million acres coming out of production of corn in the US is an incredible amount of calories that are not going to be planted to corn. And so that has all these downstream effects. And again, this crop doesn't come to harvest till, September, October. Then it's going to get processed and it turns into food. So by the time the effect of this decision-making hit the marketplace, the availability of calories and the stockpiling that's going on, it's like, boom, some countries are going to be, they're going to have a limited budget. They're only going to be able to access so much food and they can't access any. And other countries are going to be fine. The United States is going to be fine. Western Europe will be fine. China will be fine. Sri Lanka is going to be a mess. Northern and Eastern Africa is going to be a mess. I mean, there's like places around the world that we are going to have to scramble. I don't have a real easy answer. There's no simple plug and play here. It's going to be a really complex set of problems that are going to need to be solved.
Well, Sri Lanka does grow a lot of its own food, so they may be okay because they're
a net importer, right? I mean, they're a pretty big net importer. So they make a lot of food, but they rely on imports a lot for calories there. So yeah, I mean, and that's the case with a lot of places around the world. A lot of people think, oh, we have farmers, but most countries, particularly in the developing world, are net importers. They rely on third-party supplies of food. So
sure, but a lot of what you're talking about, though, are not. They're processed foods that come into the country.
Sacks, anything to add here?
Well, I mean, I think that the Ukraine war is kind of entering a chronic phase. I mean, this is sort of entering a new phase. The first phase, you'd have to say that the Ukrainians won. The Russia wanted to topple Zelensky's regime, maybe take Kyiv. They obviously failed in that. Now we're in this phase where the fighting is over in the Donbass. It's basically the civil war that's been going on there since 2014. And really, that's what it's now about. Zelensky has acknowledged that Ukraine will not be part of NATO. So that issue is kind of off the table. And so what they're really fighting over now is the status of these disputed territories in eastern Ukraine. And I think it's going to go on for a long time. That's what General Milley testified. It could go on for years. I think it's going to become a sort of permanent feature in the background of Biden's presidency. And I think the good news is that hopefully the World War III aspect is off the table. It seems like the calls for us to impose a no-fly zone or to put boots on the ground, which you were hearing a lot of a few weeks ago, seems like that's off the table. So now it's just going to be a protracted, I think, civil war going on in the Donbass between Ukraine and Russia and their proxies.
Which would mean, Sacks, correct me if I'm wrong, that Putin will be hobbled forever. They're not going to be a world power. and his power is going to deprecate because he's going to be busy fighting this non-winnable war for some period of time, which is in a way saying Biden did it perfectly and checkmated him. I'm saying that's going to be your assessment if this does go down this way, that there's like a civil war going on and Putin is crippled. That would be checkmate or no?
I think that clearly the State Department's strategy here is to make Putin bleed in eastern Ukraine and to protract this thing and make it go on as long as possible. I think that's a risky strategy because this thing could always spin out of control.
It's risky, but could it be effective? Is there a chance it could be effective?
Well, I mean, if the goal is to bleed Putin, yes, it could be effective at bleeding Putin. However, I don't know that needed to be the key geostrategic objective of the United States right now.
Okay,
I don't know because look, China is our main threat. China is a peer competitor to the United States. Russia is not. Our economy is 15 times bigger than Russia's. China's economy is about the same size as ours. That is the real threat. So, there are costs to us as well. There are clearly costs to Putin of this, but there are huge costs to us as well. Friedberg described the risk to the supply chain. We've had to now spend a lot more money building up the defense in Europe. We're going to be pinned down in Europe. We should really be moving some of those resources from Europe to East Asia. I mean, that's really where the pivot to Asia is what we thought we were supposed to be doing until quite recently. Now we're going to be bogged down there. And there's still risks of inflation and recession in the U.S. And I think if we are in a recession later this year, I think a lot of people in the U.S. will be asking, what was this all for? And if you go read my article that just came out yesterday, that was based on my speech, is published in the American Conservative. Look, this war was easily avoidable. I mean, the State Department could have avoided this war very easily.
I listened to your speech. I thought your points that you were very clear on, hey, Putin started this. He is the aggressor. It's his responsibility. But, we do need to think about our foreign policy as a country, and regime change is probably not a winning strategy for us. Although in this case, it seems like it's a possibility now. So who knows? I
don't think we're going to get regime change. But if we do, there's no reason to believe that we're going to get something much better. In every case where we've pushed for regime change, we've actually gotten the same or worse. I don't think that should be our objective. I think we have a bunch of bad options now that the war's already started. The best option would have been to avoid this war in the first place. And if this thing drags on for years and the U.S. economy tips into recession, people will look back and say, why didn't Joe Biden's State Department in the year 2021 do a much more effective job preventing this war?
Let me ask this follow-up question as we wrap here. Chamath, I've been thinking about what should a strategic objective be for America? And the number one strategic objective I could think of was, or one of the top ones would be to build a strong relationship with India, which obviously, it has an adversarial relationship with China already on the border of Pakistan. And then obviously, has relations with Russia. What would be on the top of each of your lists, Sacks and Chamath? Chamath, you go first, on priority here. If we're thinking fresh, looking at the world, with China in retreat, sort of disengaging from the West, with Russia on their heels, what could the United States and the West do as a preemptive measure to really solidify democracy and, the world order, a peaceful world order?
I'll answer it slightly differently, which is we need to put ourselves in a position to not be dependent on any country, because then we can actually dictate what we think the right approach and solution is from first principles and have the courage to stick it through to get to the other side of it. So there are really two things we need to do. The first, which we've kind of perverted unnecessarily, is energy independence. And we've allowed too many people to conflate and muddy the water on what energy independence means. Nobody was ever advocating for coal, but the amount of coal that we could have burned as a bridge fuel to LNG, which could have been a bridge fuel to things like nuclear and wind and solar, that path was pretty clear, but we got in our own way. We have to get out of our own way. Okay? So energy independence, I think, beyond anything else,
strategic,
probably an order of magnitude, it is the most important thing. And then secondarily, there are certain areas for the future of those future economies where we need to have complete capability and know-how. And the most important ones there are the specialty chemicals that we need to basically support climate change writ large, to support battery production writ large, and then semiconductors. Get those two things completely under US control, on top of energy independence. And honestly, we would be a dominant world power for the next 200 years on our terms.
So the road to resiliency. Sacks, you're now the Secretary of State. What are your key?
Hey, you, did you enjoy the show? Then please leave a comment and tell me what you particularly liked, and subscribe to make sure that you don't miss a video. I post videos on this channel 3 or 4 times per week. Have a great day.